They always get you with hope. They reel you in year after year, making you believe that this time will be different. This could be the season. All that talk about raw talent, the potential of the team, the fresh young players. The manager always says the same thing. These guys have the skills, but do they have the drive? Will they actually make a career out of this? Same story, different year, and then they crush you. Every single time. Well, Brett, it's like this. The announcer drones on the post-game radio show. The Giants are really putting it all together this season. They've got some serious talent. What are they now, 30-25? Meanwhile, we just need to keep improving. Yada, yada, yada. I switch the radio off in frustration and stare at the empty parking lot in front of me. A season ticket holder for years, I forked over $2,665 for 61 home games at the club level. Around me, the usual faces, the regulars who have been coming to Coors Field just as long as I have. We all know each other, at least by sight, if not by name. The club level is always a party. Plenty of food, plenty of booze, and we take advantage of it, win or lose. When the Rockies are winning, we drink to celebrate. When they're losing, we drink to forget. And let's be honest, they lose a lot. It's not even really about baseball anymore. It's just an excuse to get plastered. I raise my glass to no one in particular and mutter to myself, I drink to your health when we're together. I drink to your health when I'm alone. And I've drunk to your health so often lately I'm starting to worry about my own. Somebody famous said that once. No idea who. I was too drunk to remember. But I do remember laughing my head off when I first heard it. That night, the Rockies lost to the Padres 4-2, a real heartbreaker. So we threw a party, a full-blown, reckless, out-of-control rager. By the time everyone else had gone home with their girlfriends, wives, or whoever they managed to pick up at the bar, I was the only one left in the parking lot. It was 11 p.m., 3 hours after the game had ended, and I was on my hands and knees, vomiting onto the pavement beside my truck. I tried to stand, but the world tilted beneath me. My head was pounding, my legs wobbly. There was no way I could walk anywhere, not to a bus stop, not even 10 feet away. I leaned against my truck, feeling the cold metal against my cheek, and fumbled for my keys. Of course, I dropped them, right into my own puke. Perfect. And then I heard voices. Not close, but cutting through the thick haze in my brain. A woman's voice, sharp and professional. Denver 131, I'm out with Colorado ADP 735. Red Chevy Silverado in the Rockies parking lot structure. Space 325. Man down. A pause. Then the voice again, steady, calm. 131 Denver. 1040, you need backup? Negative at this time. Looks to be an intoxicated male trying to enter his vehicle. Will advise. Red and blue lights flickered across the pavement. And suddenly my night was taking a very different turn. A cop, a female cop, was walking toward me, her flashlight scanning over my hunched-over body. She was tall, with a lean, athletic build, and despite the dark, I could see the no-nonsense look in her eyes. She stopped in front of me, hands on her utility belt. "What do we have here?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. I squinted up at her. "You been drinking at the Rockies game tonight?" "Maybe a little," I slurred, trying to sound sober. "I failed miserably. Looks like you threw up all over yourself," she said, unimpressed. "Do you have any identification?" "Yes, ma'am." I reached for my backpack, lost my balance, and crashed onto the pavement, my head bouncing off the concrete. "Okay," she sighed. "Never mind. I'll get it." I lay there, my cheek pressed against the cold ground, my own vomit soaking into my shirt. "Okay, Mr. Ethan Gary Blake," she said after checking my ID. "Can you stand up?" "I don't think so," I muttered. She sighed again, the kind of sigh that said she'd seen this 1,000 times before. "Ethan, you are way too drunk to drive, and you're a danger to yourself. I'm calling a paddy wagon to take you to the drunk tank so you can dry out for the night," I groaned. "No, take me drunk. I think I'm home." She actually laughed. No, Ethan, you'd stink up my cruiser, and I have to live in that thing tonight. So you'll be okay. Just hang on. I don't remember much after that. The world blurred, then went black. I woke up in a 20 by 20 holding cell, surrounded by 13 other men who looked and smelled just as awful as I felt. The air was thick with the stench of vomit, sweat, and something worse, something I didn't want to think about. Some of the guys in there had pissed themselves, some had soiled themselves. A couple were still passed out, slumped against the grimy walls. I looked down at myself, dried puke on my shirt. My pants felt wrong. I swallowed hard, realizing I had probably done the same as them. I closed my eyes and pressed my head against the cool metal bars. How the hell did it come to this? By the time they let us out at 10 a.m., I was a mess. I was miles away from my truck, with no ride and no way of getting anywhere except on foot. They gave me back the contents of my pockets: wallet, $634 in cash, credit cards, ID, keys, a pocket knife, and a half-finished roll of lifesavers. I shoved all the lifesavers into my mouth at once, hoping to kill the taste of bile. I stumbled outside, squinting against the bright morning sun. No cabs would take me. Not dressed like this, smelling like this. I stopped at a 7-Eleven to buy a bottle of juice, but the clerk took one look at me and shook his head. Not serving you, man. You need a shower. I left without arguing. He wasn't wrong. And then the strangest thing happened. A car pulled up beside me, honking. I turned to look, blinking against the glare. It was her, the cop. She was out of uniform now, wearing jeans and a fitted black t-shirt, her blonde hair tied up in a bun. She rolled down her window and smirked at me. Need a ride back to your truck? I blinked. Officer Morgan? Isabel, she corrected. And yeah, it's me. Now, are you getting in, or are you going to walk all the way back to Coors Field smelling like that? I hesitated for only a second before nodding. Yeah. Thanks. I climbed into the passenger seat, careful not to touch anything. She reached into the glove compartment, pulled out an old newspaper, and tossed it on the seat. Sit on that, she said. And let's go. As she pulled onto the road, she glanced at me. Ethan, do you know what you said to me last night while we were waiting for the paddy wagon? I groaned. Not really. I hope I didn't insult you. She grinned. No, you said, take me drunk. I think I'm home. I closed my eyes, shaking my head. That bad, huh? Yeah, she said, her tone shifting. It was bad. But funny thing is, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because it's not just funny, Ethan, it's sad. And it got me wondering, is this home for you? Is this where you want to be? I had no answer. But for the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me. And that was the beginning. I sat in Isabel's car, staring out the window as she drove. The morning sun was too bright, my head pounded with every bump in the road, and my mouth felt like sandpaper. But her words kept echoing in my mind. Is this home for you? Is this where you want to be? I didn't know how to answer that. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to admit it. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke again. I checked your record, she said, keeping her eyes on the road. 1 DUI, 1 arrest for public intoxication, 1 arrest for fighting. I winced. Yeah, well, could have been worse. Could have been better too, she shot back. How many times do you think you didn't get caught? I exhaled heavily and rubbed my face. I don't know. More than 3, I bet. She wasn't wrong. Do you have anyone? Family? A girlfriend? Anyone who might be worried about you? Nah, I said. Just me. She glanced at me. No one at all? I swallowed. I was married, but, well, I caught her in our bed with multiple guys. That was the end of that. For the first time, I saw something soften in her expression. I'm sorry, she said, and she actually sounded like she meant it. I shrugged. It's been a while. I try not to think about it. Except you do. I didn't answer. We pulled into the parking lot at Coors Field, and she found my truck still sitting in the same spot I'd left it the night before. I sighed in relief. At least I hadn't been towed. When she put the car in park, she turned to me and handed me a piece of paper. "Call this number before you take your next drink." I frowned and looked down at the slip of paper in my hand. It was just a phone number, no name, no organization, nothing else. "What is this?" I asked. She gave me a small, knowing smile. "It's someone who can help." I wanted to roll my eyes, but I stopped myself. She wasn't nagging me. She wasn't giving me the whole "you need to change your life" speech. She was just offering. I tucked the paper into my pocket. "Thanks," I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. She nodded. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." I got out of her car and climbed into my truck. She didn't drive away immediately. She watched me for a moment, probably making sure I wasn't about to pass out in my own front seat. Finally, she pulled away, leaving me alone with my pounding headache, my wrecked dignity, and a tiny scrap of paper that suddenly felt heavier than it should. I made it home and went straight to the shower. I peeled off my disgusting clothes, wincing at the smell, and stepped under the hot water. The filth and vomit washed away, but I still felt gross inside. Like no amount of soap could scrub off the shame of where I had ended up. I had to break the pattern. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. Wasn't this the same thing I told myself every single time I woke up after a night like that? And every single time I went right back to doing it again. What made this time different, I didn't know. Maybe it was the way Isabel had looked at me, like she actually saw me. Like I wasn't just some drunk loser, but a person who still had a chance to turn things around. I got out of the shower, dried off, and walked over to my dresser. The little piece of paper she gave me was still sitting there. I picked it up, turning it over in my fingers, and then, without giving myself time to overthink it, I grabbed my phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello, this is Isabel." I froze. "You?" I blurted out. She chuckled. "Surprised?" "A little," I admitted. "I figured if I just gave you a random helpline number, you'd throw it away," she said. "This way, if you actually wanted help, you'd be talking to someone who gives a damn." I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed. "So, what now?" There was a pause on the other end. Then she said, "That depends. Are you actually ready to do something about your drinking? Or did you just call because you feel guilty?" I stared at the floor. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Well," she said, "that's a start." We met for coffee the next day. She chose a small cafe downtown, somewhere quiet. I didn't know what to expect. I half wondered if she was going to give me the full intervention speech. Instead, she just sat across from me, sipping her coffee, and let me talk. I told her about the drinking, how it had started slow, just a way to cope. How it had gotten worse after my wife left. How it had become my entire social life. Drinking at the games, drinking with the guys at the bar, drinking alone in my apartment. I expected her to judge me. Instead, she just nodded and listened. When I finally stopped talking, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "I didn't become a cop just to throw people in jail. I did it because I wanted to help people. But most of the time, my job is just dealing with the aftermath of people's bad choices. I don't usually get the chance to help them before they crash." She looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me. Hope. "I think you're a good guy, Ethan," she said. "You just need a reason to give a damn again." I swallowed. "And what if I don't have one?" She smiled. "Then maybe it's time to find one." I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything started to change. For the first time in years, I wanted to try. I didn't know if I could, but for the first time, I wanted to. For the first time in years, I wasn't drinking. It wasn't some grand decision or a declaration to turn my life around overnight. I just stopped. I didn't go to the bar. I didn't hit up the usual guys for a night out. I didn't buy a six-pack on my way home. Instead, I spent my evenings at home, staring at the walls, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do with myself. It was boring. That's the thing no one tells you about quitting bad habits. The hardest part isn't resisting temptation, it's figuring out what to do with all the empty time you suddenly have. I tried reading, but my attention span was shot. I tried working out, but my energy was too low. I sat on my couch flipping channels, restless and irritated. I didn't know how to be sober, and then, after about a week, my phone rang. "Hey, Ethan," Isabel said when I picked up. "You busy?" I glanced around at my completely uneventful, silent apartment. "Wild night over here," I said dryly. She laughed. "Good. Come meet me at Village Inn." When I got to the restaurant, Isabel was already waiting at a booth, sipping coffee. She waved me over and I slid into the seat across from her. She tilted her head, studying me. "You look better," I scoffed. "What? Because I'm not covered in puke?" "Well, yeah, that's part of it," she said with a smirk. "But mostly because you don't have that same dead-in-the-eyes look you did last week." I shrugged. "I don't feel any different." "You will," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. A waitress came by and I ordered the first thing that caught my eye: pancakes, bacon, and coffee. I wasn't really hungry, but I figured I should eat something. Isabel leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. "So, what's next?" I blinked. "Next?" "Yeah," she said. "You've stopped drinking, at least for now. But what are you going to do with yourself?" I stared at my coffee. "I have no idea." She nodded like she expected that answer. "You need a reason to stay sober, Ethan. Something to work toward." I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. "I don't know what I want anymore. I don't even know who I am without all that." "Well, let's figure it out," she said simply. She pulled a notepad from her purse, flipped to a blank page, and clicked her pen. "Okay," she said. "First question, what did you love doing before everything went to hell?" I hesitated. I used to ski." She perked up. "Yeah?" I nodded. "Haven't been in years, though." She grinned. "Then we should go." I frowned. "What, skiing?" "Yeah," she said. "Why not?" I stared at her. "You want to take a recovering alcoholic to a place that's basically a giant bar on a mountain?" She shrugged. "You don't have to drink, just ski." I hesitated. "I don't know." "Come on, Ethan," she said, nudging my foot under the table. "Let's do something fun. Something that has nothing to do with drinking or being miserable. Just living." I looked at her, at the way she was smiling at me, at the way she wasn't pitying me, but just being there. And for the first time in a long time, I said, "All right, let's do it." We drove up to Vail that weekend. It had been years since I'd last been on the slopes, and my muscles screamed in protest as I tried to remember how to balance. Isabel, despite being in peak physical shape, wasn't much better. By noon, we had both wiped out more times than we could count. We sat at the edge of the beginner slope, catching our breath, laughing. "Okay," I panted. "Maybe I wasn't as good at this as I remembered." Isabel grinned. "Hey, we made it down in one piece. That's something." I glanced at her. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her blonde hair peeking out from beneath her beanie. She looked happy, genuinely happy. And for the first time in years, I realized I was too. We skied the rest of the day, getting a little better with each run. By the time the sun started setting, we were exhausted but content. That night, back at the lodge, we sat by the fire drinking hot chocolate instead of beer. I stretched my legs out, exhaling slowly. That was a good day. Isabel smiled over her mug. "Yeah, it was." I turned my gaze toward the fire. "I can't remember the last time I had a day like this." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, she asked, "Do you want more days like this?" I looked at her. "Yeah," I admitted. "I think I do." She nodded. a satisfied look on her face. Then let's keep going. And just like that, a plan started forming. I didn't know where this was going. I didn't know what I wanted from life, but I knew one thing: I wasn't done yet. And for the first time in years, I actually wanted to see what happened next. Skiing with Isabel was the first time in years that I'd actually felt something real, something that wasn't regret, bitterness, or numbing indifference. It was fun, something I had long forgotten how to experience. And for the first time in a long while, I wanted more. I still didn't know where I was going, but at least I was moving. After we got back to Denver, I kept to myself for a while, trying to process everything. I didn't drink. I didn't go back to my old haunts. I just sat with my thoughts, which was somehow more terrifying than anything else. And then Isabel called again. "Ethan," she said, "what are you doing next weekend?" I hesitated. Nothing?" "Good," she said, "because I signed us up for a self-defense class." I nearly choked on my coffee. "A what?" "You heard me," she said. "It's a basic training course. Hand-to-hand defense, situational awareness, de-escalation tactics. It's good stuff, and I think you'd like it." I blinked. "Isabel, I'm not looking to become a cop." She laughed. "Good, because you'd be terrible at it." I scowled. "Gee, thanks." "Come on," she said. "It's physical, it's challenging, and it's something to do that doesn't involve drinking yourself into oblivion. What do you have to lose?" I sighed. "I don't know." "Look, Ethan," she said, her voice softening. "I don't care what it is. Pick something. Find something that keeps you going, something that makes you feel alive. It doesn't have to be this class, it doesn't have to be skiing. But you need something." I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. Again. "All right," I muttered. "Fine. I'll go." The self-defense class was held at a small gym downtown. The second I walked in, I felt out of place. The room was filled with cops, military guys, and people who clearly knew what they were doing. Then there was me, a guy who had spent the last several years slowly destroying himself with alcohol and bad decisions. Fantastic. Isabel clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Relax," she whispered. "No one cares how good or bad you are. They're just here to learn." I wasn't convinced, but I nodded anyway. The class started with basic drills: stance, movement, simple strikes. It wasn't long before I was sweating through my t-shirt, muscles burning from the effort, and then came the sparring. The instructor, a former Marine with arms the size of my head, paired me with a guy who looked like he bench-pressed trucks for fun. "All right, Blake," the instructor said. "Let's see what you got." What I got, apparently, was knocked flat on my ass in under 10 seconds. The room erupted in laughter as I groaned from the floor. Even Isabel was biting back a smile. "Not bad," the instructor said, offering me a hand. "Now get up and do it again." By the end of the 2-hour session, I was sore, bruised, and completely exhausted. But I also felt alive. It was the same feeling I'd had on the slopes with Isabel. That rush of doing something real, something that wasn't just another excuse to waste time. After class, I sat on the gym bench, gulping down water. Isabel plopped down next to me, nudging me with her elbow. "So?" she asked. I wiped sweat off my forehead. "So what?" "Did you like it?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah. Actually, yeah, I did," she grinned. "Good." I leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. "What are you doing, Isabel?" She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I turned my head to look at her. "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me?" Her expression softened. "Because I see you, Ethan. I see the guy who's still in there, the guy you keep trying to drown in alcohol, and I think that guy deserves a shot." I swallowed hard. "I don't know if I'm worth it." She nudged me again. "That's not for you to decide." I exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't as lost as I thought. Maybe I still had a chance. I threw myself into the training, not just the self-defense class, but everything. I started running, hitting the gym, actually taking care of myself for once. The more I trained, the better I felt. My body ached, but it was a good ache. It reminded me that I was alive, that I was stronger than I thought. The drinking, that temptation was still there, whispering at the edges of my mind. But for the first time, I had something else to focus on. Something that wasn't just trying to numb myself. And Isabel was always there, pushing me, challenging me, making sure I didn't slip back into old habits. But something else was changing too. The more time we spent together, the more I started to realize that Isabel wasn't just helping me. I was helping her too. She'd always been strong, always been in control, but I started to see the cracks in her armor. The way she pushed herself too hard, the way she never let herself slow down. One night, after another brutal training session, we sat in her car outside my apartment. She drummed her fingers on the steering wheel, staring out the windshield. "Ethan, do you ever feel like you're running from something?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "I don't know. I guess I've always been moving forward, always pushing, but I don't know if I've ever really stopped to figure out why." I studied her face, seeing something I hadn't noticed before. A kind of weariness behind her sharp, determined eyes. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," I said quietly. She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty in her expression. Maybe she needed me as much as I needed her. The months passed. I kept training. I stayed sober. Isabel and I grew closer, not just as friends, but as something more, something neither of us dared put a name to yet. One night, we sat on her couch, watching some old action movie. She glanced at me, a small smile playing on her lips. "You know, Ethan, you're different now." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah," she said, tilting her head. "You're actually living." I thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I guess I am." And for the first time in years, I actually liked who I was becoming. The more time I spent with Isabel, the more I realized just how much my life had changed. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't waking up in strange places with a pounding headache and no memory of the night before. I wasn't running from my problems anymore. Instead, I was facing them head on. At first, it was small things, waking up early to go for a run, sticking to a schedule, eating like a normal human being instead of surviving on fast food and whatever scraps were left in my fridge. But over time, those small changes added up. I felt different, stronger, clearer, in control. But there was still a part of me that was waiting for the other shoe to drop. One evening, Isabel and I were sitting at a diner, eating burgers and fries after a long day. We had been training together in the mornings, and she had started letting me tag along on her runs. "So," she said, sipping her iced tea. "What's next?" I looked up at her. "Next? Yeah. You've been doing all this work to get your life together. You've got a solid routine now. You've stayed sober for, what, 5 months? 5 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, I said automatically. She smirked. "Not that you're counting or anything." I chuckled, then sighed. "I don't know, Isabel. I haven't really thought about it. Just been taking it one day at a time." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "You're past the just surviving part, Ethan. Now it's time to actually live. What do you want?" I exhaled slowly. That was the question, wasn't it? For so long I had just been drifting, waiting for something to change, waiting for someone to pull me out of the mess I had made. But now I actually had options. "I don't know," I admitted. "I mean, I have money. I don't need to work, but I can't just sit around and do nothing for the rest of my life." She nodded. "So maybe it's time to figure that out." The next day, I decided to do something different. Instead of sleeping in, I got up early and drove downtown. I wandered through the streets, stopping by old places I hadn't been to in years. The bookstore I used to love, the little coffee shop where I had studied in college, the park where I used to go when I needed to clear my head. It felt like I was walking through someone else's life. At one point, I found myself standing in front of a campaign office. There was a big sign in the window that read, "Vote for Change." I don't know what made me do it, but I walked inside. A woman with a clipboard looked up and smiled. "Hi there. Are you here to volunteer?" I hesitated. Actually, I was just curious," she beamed. "Well, we're always looking for people to help out. You can make phone calls, go door to door, help with events, whatever works for you." I glanced around. The place was buzzing with energy, people talking, phones ringing, stacks of flyers and campaign buttons on every table. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something about it felt right. I cleared my throat. "Yeah, okay. Where do I start?" At first, it was just something to do. I showed up a few times a week, made calls, handed out flyers, did some light organizing. I didn't really care about politics, but I liked being useful. I liked having a purpose. Then, one day, a guy named Mike, one of the campaign coordinators, pulled me aside. "You ever think about getting into this for real?" he asked. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "You've got a presence, man. You're good with people and you actually care. That's rare these days." I laughed. "I don't know the first thing about politics." "Doesn't matter," he said. "You learn. The best politicians aren't the ones who've been doing it their whole lives. They're the ones who've actually lived." I shook my head. "I don't think that's me." He smirked. "Maybe not yet," but the thought stuck with me. A few weeks later, I told Isabel about it. We were sitting in her apartment eating Chinese takeout when I casually mentioned what Mike had said. She paused, chopsticks hovering over her carton of fried rice. "Huh." I raised an eyebrow. "What?" She set her food down. "I actually think that's a great idea." I blinked. "You do?" She nodded. "Ethan, you're a natural leader. People like you, they listen to you, and you actually give a damn. That's more than I can say for half the politicians in this country," I scoffed. "Yeah, well, liking people and running for office are two different things," she smirked. "Not as much as you think." I sat back, considering. Could I really do something like that? For the first time in my life, the answer didn't feel like an automatic no. I started paying more attention to the world around me. I read the news, I talked to people, I asked questions, and the more I learned, the more I realized just how messed up things were. I had spent years drowning in my own problems, but I wasn't the only one struggling. There were so many people out there who felt lost, who felt like they had no control over their lives, and maybe, just maybe, I could do something about that. The idea started as a whisper, then it became a thought, then a possibility. And then one day, I found myself sitting across from a Republican Party organizer, shaking hands and saying the words out loud for the first time. "I want to run for the Colorado State Senate." The campaign was brutal. I wasn't a career politician. I had no experience. No one took me seriously at first, but I worked harder than anyone. I met with real people. I listened. I told them my story, not the polished, sanitized version, but the real one. I told them about the drinking, the mistakes, the rock bottom. I told them about Isabel and how she had pulled me out of the darkness. I told them about how I wanted to give other people the same kind of second chance I had been given. And it worked. Against all odds, I won. When the results came in, I was sitting in Isabel's living room, pacing the floor while she watched with barely concealed amusement. When the news anchor finally announced my victory, I froze. I had done it. I was a state senator. I turned to Isabel, stunned. "Holy!" Before I could finish, she grabbed me, kissed me, and for the first time in my life, I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. And I wasn't doing it alone. Winning the Colorado State Senate seat changed everything. I had spent so much of my life feeling like I was drifting, just going through the motions, barely keeping my head above water. But now, for the first time, I had direction, I had responsibility, and I had something to prove. The first few months were a blur. I was thrown into a world of policy meetings, budget discussions, and endless debates. It was nothing like the campaign trail. Out there, it was all about connecting with people, telling my story, and getting them to believe in me. But in here, it was about doing the work. It didn't take long to realize that politics wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about navigating egos, building alliances, and picking battles carefully. I was a Republican, but I wasn't a typical one. I didn't care much for party loyalty. I just wanted to get things done. That made me popular with some and hated by others. But I didn't care. I wasn't in this for power. I wasn't in this to play games. I was in this because I had wasted too many years of my life doing nothing, and now that I had a chance to make a difference, I wasn't going to waste it. One night, after a particularly brutal session at the Capitol, I collapsed onto my couch and sighed heavily. Isabel walked in, tossing her jacket onto a chair. "Long day?" I rubbed my face. "They spent 6 hours arguing over a funding bill and we still couldn't agree on anything." She chuckled, kicking off her boots and sitting beside me. "Welcome to politics, Senator Blake." I groaned. "I don't know if I can do this, She tilted her head. "Why?" I exhaled. "Because half the time, it feels like I'm just banging my head against a wall. We argue, we fight, and in the end, nothing changes. It's exhausting." She studied me for a moment, then said, "So what are you going to do?" I looked at her, frowning. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward. "You can either quit and go back to your old life, or you can figure out a way to break through the noise. So what's it going to be?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. She was right. I wasn't the type to give up. If there was a wall in my way, I just needed to find a way around it, and that's exactly what I did. Instead of getting sucked into the political circus, I focused on what actually mattered, the people. I spent less time in my office and more time in the community. I held town halls, visited local businesses, met with families, and listened to their concerns. And slowly but surely, I built something rare in politics: trust. People saw that I wasn't just another politician. I wasn't in this for personal gain. I was here to fight for them, and because of that, things started to shift. I got bipartisan support on key bills. I helped pass funding for addiction recovery programs, something I was deeply passionate about. I worked with law enforcement and community leaders to create better mental health resources for struggling veterans. I wasn't fixing everything, but I was making real progress, and that mattered. After my first term, I ran for re-election, and I won, by a landslide. But something else happened that year, something that would change my life forever. I got a call from the Colorado Republican Party. They wanted me to run for governor. At first, I thought they were crazy. Me? Governor? I was still figuring things out, still learning the ropes. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was the next step. If I really wanted to make a difference, I needed to be in a position of power where I could actually get things done. Isabel was the first person I told. We were sitting on our balcony, watching the sun set over Denver, when I turned to her and said, "I think I'm going to run for governor." She didn't even blink. "I knew you would." I raised an eyebrow. "You did?" She smirked. "Of course. It was only a matter of time." I sighed. "I don't know, It's a huge commitment. It'll be even crazier than the Senate. More pressure, more attacks, more everything." She reached over, took my hand, and squeezed. "Ethan, you were made for this. You don't just talk about change, you make it happen." That's rare. That's why people believe in you. I swallowed. And what about you? This affects both of us. She smiled softly. I knew what I was signing up for when I met you. I exhaled, feeling the weight of the decision settle in my chest. Then I nodded. Okay. The campaign was brutal. Every part of my past was dug up and dissected. My drinking, my arrests, my failed marriage. They called me unfit, reckless, a liability. But I didn't hide from it. I owned it. I stood on stage at a debate and told the entire state exactly who I was. I'm not a perfect man. I've made mistakes. I've hit rock bottom. But I fought my way back. And if there's one thing I know how to do, it's how to take a broken system and make it stronger. Because I've done it for myself, and I'll do it for Colorado. The crowd erupted, and in November, the people made their decision. I won. On January 10th, I was sworn in as the governor of Colorado. Isabel stood beside me, her hand in mine as I took the oath of office. When it was over, I turned to her and whispered, "We did it." She smirked. "No, you did it." I shook my head. "No, Isabel, we did this together." She smiled. And in that moment, standing on the steps of the Colorado State Capitol, I realized something. I had spent years thinking I was alone, that I had to fight every battle by myself. But I wasn't alone at all. I had Isabel. I had the people who believed in me. I had a purpose, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I was meant to be. Being governor of Colorado was nothing like being a senator. In the Senate, I was one of many. I had a vote, sure, but I wasn't the one making the decisions. Now, the decisions landed on my desk, and every single one of them had consequences. The first 6 months were a whirlwind. I had inherited a budget crisis, a housing shortage, and rising crime rates in Denver and Colorado Springs. The opposition was relentless. They wanted me to fail. They expected me to fail. But I didn't, because failure wasn't an option. I spent endless nights poring over reports, holding emergency meetings, and fighting for policies that actually helped the people. I pushed for criminal justice reform, knowing firsthand how people deserved second chances, the way Isabel had given me one. I approved substantial funding for addiction recovery programs, ensuring that people who wanted help actually got it. I worked with business leaders to bring more jobs into struggling areas, focusing on education and job training instead of just throwing money at the problem. And perhaps most controversially, I reformed law enforcement policies, making it easier to hold corrupt officers accountable while also increasing support for those who served honorably. It made me a target, but I didn't care. I knew what I was doing was right, and that's all that mattered. Through it all, Isabel was by my side. She had stepped down as chief of detectives, just as she'd promised. But she didn't fade into the background. Instead, she became my closest advisor. She kept me grounded, reminded me why I was doing this when the weight of it all became too much. She saw the battles I fought every day. She saw how I was pushed to the edge, how I barely slept, how I carried the burdens of an entire state on my shoulders, and she never let me fall. One night, I came home after another brutal day. I had just vetoed a bill that would have weakened environmental protections, and the backlash was immediate. The opposition was smearing me on every news channel, calling me a sellout, claiming I had lost touch with the people. I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. Isabel sat next to me, handing me a glass of whiskey. I stared at it for a long moment before setting it aside. She raised an eyebrow. "Not drinking tonight?" I sighed. "Not tonight," she nodded. "Tough day?" I laughed bitterly. "Every day is tough." She leaned back, watching me. "Then why do you do it?" I rubbed my face. "Because someone has to." She was silent for a moment, then said, "And is that someone you?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She took a slow breath. "Ethan, you're killing yourself over this job. You don't sleep, you barely eat, You carry every single problem like it's your personal responsibility. Because it is, I snapped. No, she said calmly. It's not, I shook my head. If I don't do it, who will? She exhaled. That's the problem. You act like you're the only one who can fix things, but you're not. You don't have to do this alone. I clenched my jaw. I don't know how to do it any other way. She studied me for a moment. Then she reached out, taking my hand. Then maybe it's time you learn. I tried. I really did. But the pressure was relentless. The job was nonstop, and the threats were getting worse. I knew that being a public figure came with risks, but nothing could have prepared me for the level of hatred I was about to face. It started with angry letters, then death threats. Then one day, the windows of our home were shot out in the middle of the night. That was the moment everything changed. I was in a briefing when Isabel called. Her voice was shaken, which almost never happened. Ethan, we need to talk. What's wrong? I asked immediately. She hesitated. They found a man outside the governor's mansion last night, armed. He was waiting for you to come home. I went cold. Did they catch him? Yeah, she said. But Ethan. It's getting worse. I clenched my fist. I know, she took a slow breath. We need to talk about security. About us. The Colorado State Patrol beefed up security around me immediately. I started traveling with armed escorts. Our home was fortified. And Isabel? She never left my side. But even with all of that, I knew something had to change. I was making too many enemies, and eventually, one of them was going to get through. The Republican Party saw what was happening, and they had an idea. They wanted me to run for vice president. At first, I thought they were insane. I was barely keeping up as governor. How was I supposed to handle an even bigger role? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized. This was the next step. I had done everything I could for Colorado. But Washington? That was where the real battles were. That was where I could make a difference on a national scale. So after weeks of debating, planning, and talking to Isabel, I made my decision. The announcement was made in June. I was officially Mitt Romney's running mate for the upcoming election. The reaction was mixed. Some people celebrated, others said I was too inexperienced, that I was just a governor, that I was too much of a wild card. But the truth was, the people loved me. They loved my story. They loved that I wasn't a career politician, that I had been through real struggles, that I had climbed my way up from rock bottom. I wasn't just talking about change. I was change. And that scared a lot of people. The campaign was brutal. They attacked me from every angle. They dug up every mistake I had ever made, my arrests, my drinking, my divorce. But nothing stuck. Because I owned it all. At a rally in Phoenix, I stood before thousands of people and told them everything. I am not a perfect man. I have made mistakes. I have failed. But I have also gotten back up. And I know that if I can turn my life around, then so can this country. The crowd erupted, and on November 4th, the people made their choice. Mitt Romney was re-elected president, and I was the next vice president of the United States. On January 20th, I took the oath of office. As I raised my right hand and repeated the words, I felt Isabel's hand in mine. She squeezed it gently, her eyes full of pride. When it was over, I turned to her and whispered, "We did it." She smiled. "No, Ethan, you did it." I shook my head. "No, Isabel, we did this together." And as I looked out over the massive crowd gathered in front of the U.S. Capitol, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my journey. This was just the beginning. Being vice president wasn't just a title. It was a battlefield. It didn't take long for me to realize that I had stepped into the fire, and the flames were hotter than anything I had faced before. The first few months were relentless. I wasn't just a governor anymore. I wasn't just dealing with state issues. Now I had to worry about foreign relations, national security, economic policy, and a Congress that was divided down the middle, with half of them waiting for me to fail. But I didn't fail. because I had Isabel, and because I had already been through hell before. And I wasn't about to let this break me. The first real crisis of our administration happened just 6 months into our term, a terrorist attack overseas. American citizens killed. The media went insane. Congress was screaming for action. The president was under pressure to respond, and that's when he turned to me. Ethan, I need you to go to the Middle East. Meet with our allies. Make sure this doesn't turn into a full-scale war. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Isabel wasn't happy. Ethan, you're the vice president. You're not a diplomat. This is dangerous. I sighed. I know. She crossed her arms. So why are you doing it? I looked at her. Because if I don't, who will? She hated that answer, but she also understood it, because she would have said the exact same thing if she were in my position. I flew overseas under heavy security. Meetings with world leaders, private discussions with intelligence officials, and a press conference where I had to walk the tightrope between strength and diplomacy. I had to be firm, but not provoke. I had to show power, but not threaten war. I had to stand for justice without dragging us into another endless conflict. It was a balancing act. And it worked. The situation de-escalated. A potential global crisis was avoided. And when I returned home, the president greeted me with a firm handshake and a nod of approval. Well done, Ethan. You just proved to everyone that you belong here. But not everyone was happy. The opposition party accused me of being too aggressive. They said I was unqualified to handle diplomacy. The media called me reckless. I didn't care. Because I knew I had just saved lives, and that was all that mattered. Through it all, Isabel remained my anchor. She had officially stepped into her role as Secretary of Homeland Security, and she took the job as seriously as she had taken her time as a cop. She cleaned house. She restructured the immigration system to balance security with fairness. She cracked down on domestic terror threats, ensuring that American citizens were protected from within, and she didn't take orders from anyone, except me. But even then, I knew that if she disagreed with me, she'd let me hear it. She wasn't just my wife, she was my most trusted advisor, and I relied on her more than ever. But then, everything changed, because Mitt Romney resigned. It happened on a cold January morning in our second year in office. I was in the White House prepping for a briefing when I got the call. The president wanted to see me, immediately. I walked into the Oval Office, and Mitt was sitting at his desk looking exhausted. He gestured for me to sit. And then he said the words that changed my life forever. Ethan, I'm stepping down. I froze. What? He sighed. I've been thinking about this for months. The attacks, the constant battles with Congress, the media. I'm tired. And I'm not the man to lead this country anymore. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He leaned forward. You are. You're younger. You connect with people. They trust you. They need you. I stared at him. You're serious. He nodded. Completely. 2 weeks later, I stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, my right hand raised, and I took the oath of office. On February 1st, I became the 46th President of the United States, and Isabel stood right beside me, her hand gripping mine. We had been through so much together, and now we were about to face the biggest challenge of our lives, together. Being president wasn't just about making speeches or signing bills. It was war, a war against corruption, a war against division, a war against everything that was tearing this country apart. And I was ready for it, because I had spent my entire life fighting battles, and I had never lost one yet. The first order of business was rebuilding trust. The people were divided. Congress was dysfunctional, and the media, they were ripping this country apart. I had to be different. I had to be the leader the people actually needed. So I did something that hadn't been done in decades. I called for a national unity summit. I forced Republicans and Democrats to sit down at the same table. No cameras, no reporters, no politics, just real conversations. I told them, the American people don't care about your party. They care about their jobs, their families, their safety. So either we fix this country together, or we all fail together. It wasn't easy. The first few meetings were disasters, but over time, things started to change. People started working together, and we actually got things done. Meanwhile, Isabel was making waves of her own. As Homeland Security Secretary, she cracked down on cyber threats, domestic terrorism, and international espionage. She worked tirelessly, just as she always had, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. One night, I found her asleep in her office, surrounded by classified reports. I shook my head, covering her with my jacket. She had always been my protector. Now, it was my turn to protect her. A year into my presidency, my approval ratings were higher than anyone expected. People respected my leadership. They trusted me. For the first time in a long time, America felt hopeful again. But I knew the battle wasn't over, because enemies don't disappear. They just wait for their chance to strike. And one of them was closer than I ever imagined, because someone inside my administration was planning to take me down. And when the truth came out, it would change everything. I had always known that power attracted enemies, but I never expected one of my own people to betray me. It started as whispers, a leak in my administration, confidential discussions appearing in the press. Secret policy plans leaked before they were finalized. At first, I thought it was politics as usual. There were always people looking for an advantage, leaking information to reporters, trying to shift public opinion. But then, the leaks got worse. Suddenly, classified intelligence, real national security secrets, were showing up in the media. That wasn't just politics, that was treason. Isabel was the first to see the pattern. One night, she stormed into the Oval Office, tossing a thick folder onto my desk. "Ethan, this isn't just some political sabotage. Someone inside your administration is working against you." I glanced down at the documents. "How do you know?" She exhaled sharply. "Because I had my own team trace the leaks, and they all lead back to one person." I felt my stomach tighten. "Who?" She hesitated, and then she said the name that made my blood run cold. "Your Chief of Staff, Daniel Harrington." Daniel had been by my side for years. He was one of the first people to support my rise in politics. He had helped run my Senate campaign. He had been a key strategist when I became governor of Colorado, and when I became vice president, he was my right-hand man. He knew everything, every meeting, every plan, every classified briefing. If he was the leak, that meant I had been feeding my enemy information this whole time. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Are you sure?" Isabel nodded. 100%. We ran a deep surveillance check. The leaks started exactly when he was promoted to Chief of Staff. And guess who he's been secretly meeting with? I clenched my jaw. "Who?" She slid another document across my desk. "The opposition party. He's been feeding them information to undermine you. And it gets worse." I didn't think it could. But then Isabel hit me with the final blow. "He's also been meeting with a foreign intelligence operative, the kind that doesn't leave paper trails." I closed my eyes, feeling the full weight of the betrayal. This wasn't just political sabotage. This was espionage. I had two choices: handle this quietly, push him out, and hope the damage wasn't too deep. Make an example out of him, expose him publicly, and send a message to every enemy watching. I looked at Isabel. "What would you do?" She didn't hesitate. "I'd burn him to the ground." The next morning, I called Daniel to the Oval Office. He walked in smiling like everything was fine, like he hadn't been stabbing me in the back for months. I stayed calm, controlled. I let him dig his own grave. "You've been busy, Daniel," I said. He smirked. "Always am, Mr. President." I nodded. "I have a question for you, and I need you to be honest with me." He didn't flinch. "Of course." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Are you working against me?" For half a second, I saw it, the flicker of fear in his eyes. Then he recovered, shaking his head. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" I tossed the surveillance report onto the desk. Let me make this easy for you, Daniel. I already know. His face went pale. I don't know what this is, but I cut him off. Stop lying. You've been feeding classified intelligence to our political enemies, and worse. You've been in contact with a foreign operative. Silence. Then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed, a cold, bitter laugh. You actually think you can stop this? He sneered. You don't get it, Ethan. This isn't about you. This is bigger than you. I felt a chill run down my spine. What the hell are you talking about? Daniel leaned in. There are people who don't want you in power. Powerful people. And they've been planning this for a long time. My pulse spiked. Who? He smirked. You'll find out soon enough. I clenched my fists. You just threw your career away, Daniel. You're done. But he just smiled. No, Ethan, you are. 15 minutes later, Daniel was escorted out of the White House by Secret Service. The press erupted. The headlines called it the biggest scandal in years. My enemies pounced, trying to paint it as a failure of my leadership. But my supporters, they saw what I did. I had exposed a traitor. I had rooted out corruption from within my own administration, and I wasn't done yet. That night, Isabel and I sat in the West Wing, staring at a classified intelligence report, the one that Daniel didn't want me to see. The one that changed everything, because this wasn't just a political conspiracy, it wasn't just one traitor. There was a bigger force at play, a shadow network, powerful people who had been pulling strings for years, and now they were coming for me. Isabel exhaled. Ethan, this isn't over. I nodded, gripping her hand. I know. Because the war had just begun, and I wasn't about to lose. The betrayal ran deeper than I thought. What started as one traitor in my inner circle had unraveled something much bigger, a web of power, manipulation, and corruption that had been working behind the scenes for years, and now they were coming for me. The classified report on my desk was damning. It named multiple officials, some still in government, others retired but still pulling strings. Politicians, intelligence operatives, corporate executives, all connected. Some of them had been influencing policy, while others were working directly against the administration. But the most shocking part, it wasn't just about me. This had been going on long before I ever stepped into office, and now it was my fight. Isabel sat across from me, her eyes scanning the documents. We always knew the political world was dirty, she muttered. But this is another level. I nodded. We need to find out who's behind this, who's leading it. She exhaled, flipping through another page. We already know one. I looked at her. She tapped a name on the document, Senator Wallace Carrington. Carrington was a veteran politician, a high-ranking senator from the opposition party, a man who had been in the system for over 40 years. And according to these documents, he was at the center of everything, leaking intelligence, pulling strings, working with foreign agents. I had shaken hands with this man. I had stood beside him in public events, and the entire time, he had been working against me. We have two options, Isabel said. One, we take him down publicly, expose everything, let the media rip him apart. I folded my arms. And the second? She leaned in. We go after him in the shadows. Quietly. We dismantle his network piece by piece before he even knows what's happening. I sighed. If we go public, we start a political war. Every one of his allies will turn on us. She nodded. And if we go quiet? We'll be playing his game, and he's been playing it a lot longer than us, I exhaled. Either way, this is going to get ugly. I couldn't afford mistakes, so I called in the best minds I knew. A group of former military intelligence officers, cybersecurity experts, people who had worked in the shadows before, but this time they would be working for me. We met off the record, not in the White House, not in the Capitol. A safe house in Virginia, away from prying eyes, and we put together a plan. First, we dug deep into Carrington's connections. We followed the money. We traced every meeting, every phone call, every secret deal, and it didn't take long before we found something big. A foreign account, offshore, hidden under layers of fake businesses, and a series of high-dollar transactions. The payments were coming from a private defense contractor, one that had been lobbying against my administration for months. I leaned back in my chair. So this isn't just politics. One of my analysts nodded grimly. It's about power and money. They want you out because you're in their way. The second move was pressure. We leaked just enough information to the press, just a small piece of what we knew, enough to make Carrington sweat, enough to make his allies second-guess their loyalty, and it worked. Within days, the senator started making panicked calls. Meetings were being canceled. His usual allies? They weren't returning his calls. Because in Washington, nobody wants to go down with the sinking ship. The real break came 2 weeks later. One of Carrington's closest aides, a guy named Tom Henshaw, flipped. He showed up at a safe location, ready to talk. He was terrified. "They're watching me," he whispered, looking over his shoulder. "If they know I'm here, I'm dead." I leaned in. "Then let's make sure they don't find out." And then he started talking. What he told us? It changed everything, because Carrington wasn't the top of the food chain. There was someone above him, someone more powerful, more dangerous. And they weren't going to let me walk away from this fight alive. That night, Isabel and I sat in the residence, staring at everything we had uncovered. She shook her head. "Ethan, we're in way deeper than we thought." I nodded. "This isn't just a battle anymore. This is a war," she exhaled. "So, what's the next move?" I looked at her. "We take the fight to them, because if they wanted a war, they were about to get one. I had spent my entire presidency fighting battles in the open. Political battles, policy fights, media storms. But this was a war in the shadows, and now it was time for the final move. Carrington was collapsing under pressure. His allies were abandoning him one by one. The press was tearing him apart, digging into his past, questioning his connections, exposing his secrets, but he was still just a piece of the puzzle, because the man above him, the one truly pulling the strings, was still in the dark. We had a name now. Donovan Pierce, billionaire, defense contractor, power broker, and the man who had been orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. Pierce was untouchable in the traditional sense. He had no official government role. He didn't have to answer to Congress. He wasn't an elected official, but he owned people. Senators, generals, intelligence officers. He controlled contracts worth billions. And most importantly, he had the power to make or break presidencies, including mine. And now I was coming for him. The operation had to be flawless. We couldn't afford mistakes. If we went in too hard, too fast, Pierce would bury everything, disappear into the shadows, and we'd never get another shot at him. So we set a trap. We let him think that Carrington was still loyal, that the senator was doing damage control, trying to save himself. Through carefully planted leaks, we made sure Pierce believed Carrington still had one last play to make, and then we waited. It took 5 days. On the 6th, Pierce made his move. He arranged a private meeting, not in Washington, but in a secured compound in Montana. A private estate protected by armed guards, high-tech surveillance, and layers of security. Carrington was invited. What Pierce didn't know? Carrington was already ours, and he was wearing a wire. The conversation was all we needed. Carrington, desperate and broken, begged for help. Pierce, arrogant and confident, laid it all out. His network, his operations, the politicians he had bought, the moves he had made against my administration, and then the fatal mistake. Pierce leaned forward. "This is bigger than just you or me, Carrington. The president? He's just a pawn. We put them in, we take them out. And if he doesn't fall in line, we remove him." Carrington gulped. "What do you mean, remove?" Pierce smirked. "Accidents happen. We control everything. If he steps out of bounds, he won't be president for long. That was all I needed. The moment he said those words, the FBI team moved in. They had been listening in real time, waiting for confirmation. Agents stormed the compound, moving fast, cutting through security like a knife through butter. Pierce tried to run. He never made it to his private helicopter. By the time he reached the landing pad, he was in handcuffs. The charges? Conspiracy, bribery, treason, and attempted interference in government affairs. Carrington would go to prison. But Pierce, he was about to lose everything. When the news broke, Washington exploded. Headlines screamed about the corruption, the money trails, the power struggles. The media called it one of the biggest political takedowns in American history. For the first time in decades, people saw that no one was above the law, not even a man as powerful as Pierce. And the message was clear. This presidency would not be controlled, not by lobbyists, not by corporations, not by the old power players who thought they could manipulate the system forever. That night, Isabel and I sat on the balcony of the White House, looking out over the National Mall. She took a slow sip of her drink, then exhaled. "You did it," she said. I shook my head. "We did it." She looked at me. "You know they'll never stop trying, right?" I nodded. "They'll always come for us." She leaned against me, her voice quiet but firm. "Then we'll always be ready." And just like that, I knew. No matter how powerful the enemy, no matter how deep the corruption ran, no matter what battles lay ahead, we would face them together, and we would win, because no one controls the future, except the ones willing to fight for it. The war was over, but the fight had only just begun. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, leave a comment below to share your thoughts on what happened. Take care.